Welcome back to QHSE Talks. Imagine walking into a boardroom, right? You're standing there in front of a dumpily skeptical CFO, and you're telling them that a $20,000 robotic lift isn't an expense.
Right, which is usually a tough sell.
Oh, absolutely. But then you look them in the eye and you prove, like mathematically, that it's actually the single highest performing profit generator in the entire company.
Yeah, and that just, it completely changes the entire temperature of the room. I mean, suddenly you aren't the compliance police anymore.
Yeah.
You're a strategic business partner.
Exactly. And that transformation, that's really the entire mission of this session of QHSE Talks. Because if you're listening to this right now, you might be preparing for the ASP 11 exam. Specifically, Domain 1, Topic 13.
Which is a heavy one.
It really is. Or, you might just be a safety professional who is completely exhausted by the constant battle to secure budget for your department. Like, your interventions are saving lives. They're preventing catastrophic injuries. But the moment you try to explain that to upper management, you just, you hit a wall.
You hit a wall because, there's a fundamental language barrier there. I mean, the safety professional is speaking the language of, hazard control and risk matrices and human well-being.
Right.
But the C-suite, they operate on a completely different frequency. They speak the language of capital allocation, yield, and return on investment.
Yeah, so we are going to break down that barrier today. We have a pretty formidable stack of sources here: exam study guides, technical handbooks, textbook excerpts, and we are unpacking the economics of safety.
It's so necessary.
It is. We're going to decode the exact financial indicators you need. Things like cost-benefit analysis, return on investment, life cycle costs. By the time we're done here, you will have the vocabulary and really the analytical framework to prove the definitive financial value of your department.
And, the necessity of this really comes down to understanding how a corporation actually functions at its core. Like, safety does not exist in a vacuum.
No, not at all.
It's a business unit. And every single business unit is locked in this constant, fierce competition for limited resources.
Right. You're competing for employee time, capital expenditures, budget allocations, and you're up against marketing, research and development, IT, sales.
Yeah, and historically, let's be honest, safety has lost those battles. When you look at the literature, it's pretty frustrating to see how often safety is categorized by management as a sunk cost.
Yeah, just a black hole for money.
Exactly. Gets mentally filed away as this annoying, compliance-driven tax on the business. The attitude is so often, we have to buy these machine guards so regulatory agencies don't fine us.
Right, instead of seeing the machine guard as an asset that actively protects the production timeline.
Exactly. And that historical view, it really stems from the difficulty of charging the end-line consumer for safety.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, think about it. When a customer buys a smartphone or a car, they aren't looking at a line item on their receipt for the manufacturer's hazard control program.
Right, there's no safety surcharge on the sticker.
Exactly. So because the value isn't immediately visible in the retail price, short-sighted managers just view the safety program as money draining out of the bottom line. But the source material emphasizes this massive paradigm shift that's happening in elite organizations right now. Savings being repositioned as an investment center rather than a cost center.
I love that distinction, an investment center. Let's dig into what that actually means for the person listening to this, especially if they're trying to pass that ASP 11 exam. An investment center isn't just a place where money goes to die.
So from it, I mean, investment allocators within a firm, the people actually holding the purse strings, they fund projects for one primary reason. They expect a measurable return that contributes to the overall economic performance of the firm.
Oh.
So when you frame safety as an investment center, you are promising a return.
So the modern safety professional truly has to be like a bilingual translator.
Now, that's a great way to put it.
Right, because you're out on the factory floor talking about lockout, tagout procedures and ergonomic risk factors. But the second you cross the threshold into the executive suite, you have to switch fluently to the language of operational efficiency and financial leverage.
You're translating the physical reality of keeping people whole into the financial reality of keeping the business solvent.
Okay, but I do want to push back on this a little bit, because this brings up a tension I definitely felt while reading through these textbooks.
Okay, lay it on me.
If the fundamental goal of an occupational health and safety program is to protect human life, which, we all agree is invaluable, doesn't it feel inherently cold to reduce a person's physical well-being to dollars and cents?
I hear that all the time.
Feels almost cynical, right? To tell a safety manager they need to calculate the ROI of preventing a worker from losing a finger. Like, exactly how do we reconcile the moral imperative of safety with the cold calculus of corporate finance?
It is a profound dilemma. And to be fair, the texts do not shy away from it at all. Attempting to assign a strict economic value to a human life is, well, it's an incredibly difficult, often uncomfortable exercise.
Very.
But the literature points to the work of pioneers like Frank Bird to address this friction. Bird introduced this concept, the axiom of economic association.
The axiom of economic association. Okay, what is that?
It essentially states that a manager will simply pay far more attention to information and act on it with greater urgency when it is expressed in cost terminology.
Oh, wow. So it's basically a behavioral hack.
It is a behavioral reality.
Yeah.
It isn't about being cold. It's about being effective.
Yeah.
I mean, if your ultimate moral goal is to secure the $50,000 needed to install an upgraded ventilation system, one that will prevent respiratory illness, you have to use the tool that actually gets the check signed.
Right. You can't just rely on goodwill.
Exactly. If expressing the hazard in financial terms is the lever that moves the CEO, then the safety professional has an absolute duty to pull that lever. You speak the language of the decision maker to achieve the moral outcome for the worker.
Okay, that reframes it completely for me. It is a necessary means to a vital end.
Exactly.
So if we are going to speak this language, we kind of have to start at the beginning. Before we can prove how much money a safety intervention saves, we have to accurately prove how much an accident actually costs.
Right, the base.
Because if you don't know the true magnitude of what you're losing, your ROI calculations are going to be completely anemic.
Spot on. And this is where we encounter the anatomy of a loss. The sources divide incident costs into two major categories: direct costs and indirect costs. And honestly, the misunderstanding of this dynamic is where most safety pitches fail.
Let's tackle the visible stuff first, the direct costs. Reading through the material, these are the expenses that generate an immediate, undeniable paper trail.
Right. You can calculate them and assign them directly to the incident with almost perfect accuracy.
We're talking about like the ambulance bill, the emergency room medical expenses, the mandated workers' comp payments, the invoice for repairing the forklift that crashed, and the inevitable OSHA non-compliance fines. It's basically the tip of the iceberg.
The tip of the iceberg is the absolute perfect metaphor because this is the only part the CFO can clearly see from their office. But the existential threat to the company's bottom line is that massive structure lurking beneath the waterline. These are the indirect costs, which are often referred to in foundational safety literature as Heinrich's hidden costs.
I really want to spend some time on this because the source material provides a massive list of these hidden costs. And as I was reading them, I realized how incredibly disruptive a single accident is to the entire ecosystem of a business.
Oh, it's staggering.
These are tangible hits to the company's operations, but they're notoriously difficult to capture on a standard ledger. So let's walk through the ripple effect of a supposedly isolated injury.
Sure. Consider the immediate aftermath on the floor. Beyond the obvious lost time of the injured employee themselves, you have the immediate cessation of work by the entire surrounding crew.
Right. If someone goes down, nobody just keeps working. Coworkers rush over to provide first aid or clear the area or simply just try to process the shock of what just happened.
Exactly. You might have a dozen people standing down for an hour. Production has dropped to zero, but the payroll clock is still ticking at full speed for every single one of them.
And then the supervisor gets pulled off their primary duties.
Yeah, they aren't managing the line or monitoring quality control anymore. They are securing the scene, managing the medical response, beginning the preliminary incident investigation, and frantically trying to rewrite staffing schedules to cover the sudden gap in the roster.
And then the administrative burden just explodes, right? The company's internal medical staff, HR personnel, the safety team, they're all now dedicating hours, maybe days, to case management, regulatory reporting, internal audits.
And the operational ripple just continues outward from there. Because that line went down, production slowed. That leads to delayed shipments or entirely unfilled orders.
Which means lost revenue.
More than just lost revenue. You are now looking at the loss of performance bonuses. Or worse, triggering penalty clauses in your client contracts. The machine the injured worker was operating just sits idle. That's an expensive capital asset generating zero revenue while continuing to depreciate.
Even when the worker eventually returns, the texts point out the lingering costs like they might be on restricted light duty, operating at a fraction of their normal productivity, but still drawing their standard wage.
Right, and we absolutely cannot ignore the psychological impact on the rest of the workforce. When people see a colleague get hurt, morale plummets.
Yeah, they might work slower out of fear.
Or they might become disengaged, which inevitably leads to further reductions in overall facility output. Meanwhile, all the overhead costs, the rent for the building, the massive utility bills, the baseline insurance premiums, none of that pauses just because your assembly line had a crisis.
When you aggregate this entire chain reaction of hitting costs, the mathematical reality is just staggering. And the sources highlight a specific multiplier that honestly blew my mind.
The 4 to 5 multiplier.
Yes. Depending on the industry sector, during the first few months following a lost time injury, the indirect cost can be 4 to 5 times higher than the direct costs.
The financial bleeding is incredibly front-end loaded. The initial chaos of investigation, shifting personnel, and stabilizing the operation, it incurs massive hidden expenses before the dust even settles.
So let's put some hard numbers to that for everyone listening. If a worker suffers a laceration that requires surgery and the direct medical and workers' comp costs come to, say, $10,000.
Right.
The safety manager needs to realize the company is actually bleeding $40,000 to $50,000 in hidden indirect operational losses.
Exactly.
The real cost isn't 10 grand, it's 60 grand.
Which completely alters the calculus when you are asking for a $5,000 safety intervention.
Absolutely.
The texts also provide a crucial framework for categorizing the scope of these losses, which is important for the exam: internalities versus externalities.
That distinction stood out to me. Can you break down how a safety professional should view internalities?
Sure. Internalities are the localized events. They're incidents that affect only the internal manufacturing or operational processes of the firm.
Okay.
They involve adversity or disablement to an internal resource, like an employee or a piece of equipment, and they incur the direct and indirect costs we just outlined. They disrupt the internal supply chain, but the damage remains firmly within the walls of the facility.
So, like a chemical spill that is entirely contained within a designated secondary containment berm inside the warehouse.
Yes, perfect example.
It ruins inventory, it requires an expensive internal cleanup crew, and it halts the warehouse operations for a day, but it never touched the outside world.
Exactly. Now, externalities, on the other hand, occur when that internal incident breaches the facility's defenses and impacts the outside environment and the community.
So the chemical spill bypasses the containment berm, flows out the loading dock doors, and leaches into the local municipal water supply.
Yes. And suddenly, the scale of the financial liability changes exponentially. You are no longer just dealing with internal production delays. You are looking at devastating non-compliance fines from federal environmental agencies.
Oh, yeah.
You face massive legal expenses from community lawsuits. You have to fund long-term environmental remediation and habitat restoration, which, that can take decades.
And the PR nightmare.
Exactly. The indirect costs include catastrophic reputational damage, the loss of community goodwill, and the sheer number of executive hours consumed by public relations, crisis management, and endless litigation. The key insight for the safety professional here is that externalities eventually boomerang back to the company as massive, sometimes fatal, internal financial burdens.
I see the logic. I really do. But I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Yeah.
Imagine I take this entire argument into the CFO's office. I say, we need to invest 50 grand to redesign this workflow. If we don't, we risk an injury that will trigger a 5-to-1 multiplier in intangible costs like lowered morale, supervisor distraction, and potential reputational damage.
Right.
I feel like a hardened finance executive is going to look at me like I'm trying to pay them in Monopoly money. Like, how do you bridge the gap when the biggest costs you are warning them about don't generate a neat printable receipt?
That is the ultimate bottleneck in safety communication. You cannot walk into a budget meeting leaning heavily on the word morale. You have to translate those nebulous indirect costs into everyday hard business metrics that the CFO already tracks obsessively.
Right.
And thankfully, the source text provides specific, highly effective mathematical models to accomplish exactly this.
And this is where we get into the absolute core of the material for the ASP 11 exam. The sources give us these specific translation formulas that turn safety losses into brutal business realities. Let's dissect the first one. I'm calling it the profit margin translation.
The foundational logic here is critical for a safety professional to grasp. When an accident costs the company money, that cost does not come out of top-line revenue.
Okay, wait, unpack that.
It is a direct dollar-for-dollar hit to the company's net profit. It comes straight out of the bottom line. Therefore, to recover from that loss, the company cannot simply generate new revenue equal to the cost of the accident. It has to generate enough massive new revenue to produce a profit margin equal to the loss.
Wow. Okay, the formula in the text lays this out so clearly. It states that the cost of the loss equals the profit margin multiplied by the volume of business needed to cover it. The text provides this chillingly clear example to illustrate this.
The widget example.
Yes, the widget example. So imagine a company produces a widget, and after all their overhead, materials, and labor, they make a neat $15 net profit on every single unit they sell.
Okay, now, a relatively minor incident occurs on the floor. And after accounting for some direct medical care and those hidden operational disruptions we discussed, the true cost of that incident is calculated at $500.
To a massive corporation, a $500 loss sounds like a rounding error. It sounds like something you just write off and completely ignore.
But look at what the text reveals when you apply the profit margin translation. To recoup that $500 loss, you cannot just sell $500 worth of product.
Because that's revenue, not profit.
Exactly. You have to generate $500 in pure profit. So if each item yields $15 in profit, you must divide the $500 loss by the $15 profit margin.
Which means the organization has to manufacture, market, and sell approximately 34 additional units just to break even on that one minor incident. But, the text actually uses a more extreme example with a higher loss multiplier to make the point. It states that to cover a seemingly small incident, an organization might have to sell 1,000 items.
Right. Let's contextualize why the text uses such a high volume. If a company has a very tight margin, say just a $5 profit per item, and suffers a $5,000 comprehensive loss,
they suddenly have to move 1,000 units for free.
Yes. The entire manufacturing apparatus, the logistics chain, the sales team, they have to grind out 1,000 successful sales, and the company sees absolutely zero financial gain from that massive effort. Every ounce of profit from those 1,000 items is swallowed whole by the accident.
The text also applies this to the construction bidding process, which I thought was just brilliant. It gives an example of a contracting firm operating on a 5% profit margin.
Construction margins are notoriously razor thin, which makes this translation highly potent for them.
Right. So the text points out that for every $100 the construction firm loses to an accident, they have to bid on, win, and execute $2,000 worth of new jobs just to recover that $100, because 5% of 2,000 is 100.
And the scenario escalates drastically when you factor in the reality of the bidding process itself. The text notes that a firm might have to bid on 10 jobs just to win one.
Right. So to cover that tiny $100 safety loss, they have to expend the administrative resources to bid on $20,000 worth of work, hoping to win the $2,000 job, just to generate the $100 profit to fix the mistake.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
The text extrapolates this to a major claim. If there's a severe injury resulting in a $10,000 comprehensive loss, the firm has to bid on $2 million worth of projects, win 200,000 of them, and complete the work flawlessly just to get back to zero.
When you take those metrics to a VP of sales or a plant operations manager, you entirely bypass their skepticism about indirect costs. You aren't talking about safety anymore. You're talking about the sheer volume of product they have to push through the system just to tread water. It makes the abstract concept of hazard control a highly urgent, concrete operational priority.
It paints a vivid picture. It's like the entire company is walking on a treadmill at a comfortable pace. An injury happens, which essentially means someone accidentally cranked the speed dial to maximum, increased the incline, and now the entire workforce has to sprint for 10 miles just to stay in the exact same financial spot they were in yesterday.
That's a great analogy. It is a terrible way to run a business.
It is.
Now, there's a second translation method provided in the sources that targets a totally different audience. The profit margin translation works wonders on executives and sales directors. But for the frontline supervisor, the person actually managing the floor, the text recommends the worker hours translation.
Okay, the worker hours translation. The underlying question here is just visceral. Like, how many hours of grueling human labor does it take to pay off a safety failure? Let's use the example from the text.
Sure. The scenario assumes a worker earns a wage of $20 an hour. An incident occurs on their shift that results in a moderate $2,000 comprehensive loss to the company.
The math is straightforward, but the implication is super heavy. You take the $2,000 loss and divide it by the $20 hourly wage. That equals 100 hours of labor.
100 hours. In the context of a standard 40-hour work week, that is 2.5 full weeks of labor.
Imagine sitting down with a shift supervisor and explaining that because of a skipped lockout-tagout step that caused a $2,000 machinery repair, one of their best employees essentially has to show up, sweat on the line, and work for 2.5 weeks producing absolutely zero value for the company.
Right, they're basically working off a debt.
Yeah.
The source material highlights this specific translation because it is uniquely motivational. If you tell a shift supervisor that workplace accidents cost the national economy $500 billion a year, their eyes will just glaze over.
The number is just too big.
Exactly. It's too astronomical to have personal meaning. But if you tell that same supervisor that a specific hazard on their line is going to cost them 3 weeks of free labor and completely destroy their shift's productivity metrics, you will see behavior change instantly. You have made the financial impact intensely personal and localized.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork here. We know why we must speak finance. We understand the hidden depths of indirect costs, and we know how to translate those losses into real leverage.
The fun stuff.
Now, we are diving into the technical heart of the material. For anyone aiming to conquer ASP 11 Domain 1 Topic 13, this is where you need to focus. We're going to explore the big 5 financial indicators.
The essential tools.
Exactly. These are the specific analytical tools you will use to evaluate interventions and secure your budget.
And these indicators, they really elevate safety from a reactive compliance exercise into a proactive strategic discipline. The first tool in the framework is cost-benefit analysis, commonly referred to as CBA.
Right, CBA. The text defines cost-benefit analysis as a generic, systemic process used to evaluate competing courses of action. You are essentially weighing the total dollar costs of implementing a hazard control method against the total dollar value of the benefits received from that intervention.
It is the ultimate tool for assessing trade-offs. Organizations rarely have unlimited capital, so they have to choose between different safety interventions constantly. A rigorous CBA ensures they choose the option that maximizes the net value to the firm over a specified time horizon.
Let's ground this in reality by walking through a specific exam scenario drawn directly from the text.
Okay.
So a manufacturing company recognizes a chronic ergonomic hazard on their assembly line, and they're considering 2 different safety interventions over a 5-year evaluation period. Option A is a comprehensive engineered overhaul of the workstation. It has a steep upfront cost of $50,000, but the data projects will save $30,000 per year in injury costs and lost productivity.
Okay, and option B?
Option B is a much more modest intervention, perhaps an administrative control combined with some minor equipment adjustments. It costs only $20,000 upfront, but it only generates $5,000 per year in savings. The fundamental question is, which method should the company choose based on a 5-year cost-benefit analysis?
Right, and the instinct for a lot of budget-conscious managers is to immediately grab option B.
Because the initial sticker price is $30,000 cheaper.
Exactly. And that instinct is exactly what a CBA is designed to correct. We have to calculate the net benefits over the entire 5-year horizon. So let's analyze option A first. It yields $30,000 in savings annually. Over 5 years, that is a total gross benefit of $150,000.
But we can't ignore the massive initial capital outlay. We take the $150,000 total benefit and subtract the $50,000 upfront cost. That leaves the company with a net benefit of $100,000 over the 5 years.
Now apply the exact same rigor to option B. It saves $5,000 annually. Over 5 years, the gross benefit is $25,000. Subtract the $20,000 initial cost, and the net benefit is a mere $5,000.
The comparison is stark. By doing the full analysis, the safety professional can prove that choosing the quote-unquote cheaper option B is actually a terrible financial decision.
Right.
Option A, despite requiring more than double the initial investment, generates 20 times the net value over the lifespan of the project. $100,000 versus $5,000.
This illustrates a pervasive trap in corporate finance known as short-termism. Managers are often heavily incentivized to minimize current year capital expenditures just to make quarterly budgets look healthy.
So they focus entirely on the upfront cost and ignore the long-term cash flows.
Exactly. The cost-benefit analysis is the safety professional's weapon against short-termism. It forces the organization to look at the entire operational picture.
Which flows perfectly into our second major indicator. Once you prove that an intervention creates a net benefit, the CFO is going to want to know the efficiency of that capital. They want to know how hard their money is working. This brings us to return on investment, or ROI.
The source texts emphasize that ROI speaks the ultimate, universal language of business. Whether you are buying a new software platform, acquiring a competitor, or installing a machine guard, ROI illustrates the measure of profitability. It is the core metric used to justify equipment purchases and program resource expenditures.
The philosophy behind ROI is the oldest rule in business, right?
Yep.
You have to spend money to make money.
Precisely. In the context of safety, the return might manifest as drastically reduced workers' compensation loss rates, lower insurance premiums, or even increased throughput because workers are no longer fatigued by poor ergonomics.
Right.
The formula to find the ROI percentage is pretty straightforward. You take the net savings, which is your total savings minus your initial investment, and divide it by the initial investment.
Let's look at the Oregon OSHA, or OSHA, example detailed in the text. This is a brilliant case study for showing management a massive, undeniable win. Imagine you are a safety manager and you identify a severe machine guarding hazard. The engineering team tells you the investment to fabricate and install the guard is $1,000.
Okay.
However, your analysis of past incident data and those indirect cost multipliers we talked about reveals that if you do not fix this hazard, the potential direct and indirect accident costs over the next 5 years will total $28,000.
Okay, so to find the ROI, we look at the efficiency of the capital deployed. The investment is $1,000. The benefit is the avoidance of the $28,000 cost. So when you divide the $28,000 benefit by the $1,000 investment, you get a ratio of 28 to 1.
Right.
To express this as a percentage, you just multiply by 100.
The result is a 2,800% return on investment over 5 years. And if management asks for the annualized rate, you just divide that by the 5-year time frame, which gives you an annual ROI of 560%.
As the text rightly points out, an annual ROI of 560% is spectacular. It is almost unheard of in traditional financial markets. If a mutual fund manager promised a 560% annual return, they would be investigated for fraud.
Right, it sounds fake.
But in the realm of hazard elimination, where a tiny, inexpensive intervention can prevent a catastrophic multi-million-dollar facility fire or severe injury, these astronomical returns are entirely real and mathematically sound.
Let's tackle another exam question from the text, this one dealing with wearable safety technology, specifically an exoskeleton. This is highly relevant as companies start looking at biomechanical interventions, The scenario states, an organization invests $10,000 to purchase exoskeletons for a crew of workers who must continuously attach heavy bolts during an assembly project. The data shows this equipment saves $15,000 annually in avoided medical injuries and lost time. What is the ROI?
Okay, we apply the standard formula. We determine the net savings by taking the $15,000 annual benefit and subtracting the $10,000 initial cost.
Leaving us with $5,000 in pure net savings in the first year alone.
Then, to find the return percentage, we divide that $5,000 net savings by the original $10,000 capital investment,
which yields 0.5. Multiplied by 100, the result is a 50% ROI.
Again, we need to put that in a corporate context. A CFO might look at a 50% ROI and just shrug, but they absolutely shouldn't. In the broader business landscape, a legitimate, guaranteed 50% return on a capital expenditure is incredibly rare and highly coveted.
Oh, yeah. If a marketing department promised a 50% return on an ad spend, they would get unlimited funding.
Exactly. The safety professional must confidently present that 50% ROI as a massive operational victory.
However, presenting a strong ROI often triggers the very next question in the capital allocation process, doesn't it? The executive team agrees the return is fantastic, but they're dealing with tight cash flow constraints. They want to know exactly when the company gets its initial seed money back.
Yes, the timing.
And this introduces our third core indicator, the payback period.
I love the payback period metric because it is so incredibly tangible. It answers the simple question: How long does it take for this piece of equipment to literally pay for itself?
Let's break down the lifting robot exam question from the text.
This scenario addresses a classic logistics and warehouse hazard. The problem details that a facility requires workers to manually move heavy 55-gallon drums from a conveyor belt onto a pallet. The historical data shows the average comprehensive cost of a recordable back strain injury from this specific task is $44,000. Furthermore, the facility experiences an average of 4 of these specific back strains every single year.
First, we have to calculate the total annual bleed caused by this hazard. 4 injuries a year, multiplied by an average cost of $44,000 per injury, equals a total annual loss of $176,000. That specific spot on the warehouse floor is essentially setting $176,000 on fire every 12 months.
Right. So the safety team proposes a solution: purchasing and installing an automated lifting robot. The total installed cost of the robot is $20,000. The question asks for the payback period. To find this, we divide the total capital cost of the intervention by the total annual savings it generates.
So by installing the robot, the manual handling hazard is eliminated entirely, meaning the annual savings equals the entire $176,000 loss avoidance.
Exactly. So we take the $20,000 investment and divide it by the $176,000 annual savings. The math gives us a result of approximately 0.1136 years.
But obviously, presenting a metric like 0.11 years in a boardroom is just clunky and unintuitive. We need to convert it into a time frame people understand.
We multiply that fraction of a year by 12 months. 0.1136 times 12 gives us 1.36 months.
We round that up, and the answer is 1.4 months. The payback period is less than 6 weeks.
Think about the rhetorical power of that calculation during a budget dispute. You are not walking in asking for a favor of $20,000 to buy a fancy piece of technology.
Right.
You are pointing a spotlight at a massive $176,000 leak in their operational cash flow, and you are proving that the $20,000 plug you want to buy will completely pay for itself by the middle of next month.
It is an airtight argument. It's like asking, at what point does the solar panel stop costing me money and start giving me free electricity? In the case of the lifting robot, every single operational day after day 42 represents pure compounding profit savings for the company.
The payback period is a highly persuasive metric, particularly for startups or organizations facing temporary liquidity issues. They often have strict internal guidelines requiring capital projects to pay for themselves within short windows, like 6 to 18 months. Proving a 6-week payback almost guarantees project approval.
All right, let's transition to our fourth metric, life cycle cost, or LCC. This concept feels like the necessary antidote to the short-termism trap we discussed during the cost-benefit analysis segment.
Lifecycle costing enforces a rigorous, cradle-to-grave perspective on all major purchases and programmatic decisions. The core philosophy is that the initial sticker price is often the least important variable in the true cost of an asset.
Because it hides all the future costs.
Exactly. LCC dictates that all cash flows relevant to the decision must be meticulously aggregated and analyzed.
This covers a massive timeline. You are looking at the costs incurred during the conception and engineering design phase, the actual acquisition cost, the friction of startup and integration, the immense costs of operation and maintenance over its entire useful life, and eventually the cost of decommissioning, disposal, or salvage.
The text uses an incredibly relatable everyday example to illustrate the danger of ignoring life cycle costs. The consumer computer printer.
Yes, the printer trap. We have all fallen victim to this. You walk into an electronics store and you see a printer deeply discounted for $49. You focus entirely on the initial acquisition cost and think you are getting a massive bargain.
But you're being penny wise and pound foolish. By focusing solely on the acquisition, you ignore the exorbitant recurring life cycle costs of having to purchase proprietary ink cartridges over the next 5 years. Ultimately, you pay many times the initial sticker price in operational maintenance.
The same brutal logic applies to complex safety investments, particularly human capital. The text points out that when a company decides to hire a new safety manager, the executives often just look at the base salary and think, okay, this costs us $80,000 a year.
A true life cycle cost analysis reveals a much deeper financial commitment. The firm must account for the less obvious direct costs: payroll taxes, comprehensive fringe benefits, providing the employee with IT infrastructure, like a computer and mobile device.
Right, and projected annual salary increases.
Exactly. Plus the escalating cost of overhead, the vital cost of their ongoing professional training and certifications, and even the eventual costs associated with their exit from the company, such as retirement contributions or severance packages.
It provides a brutally honest view of the financial commitment. However, while reading this section, I noticed the text introduces a really important nuance regarding how businesses actually apply this theory in the real world. It discusses a concept called abridged life cycle costing.
Yes. The abridged methodology is a fascinating compromise between economic theory and business reality. A pure, theoretically perfect life cycle costing model would require an organization to calculate not just their internal expenses, but all the external societal costs of their operations.
Meaning they would have to quantify those externalities we talked about earlier, the environmental degradation, the strain their pollution puts on the local municipal healthcare system over a 50-year horizon.
Precisely the problem. Internal stakeholders, particularly corporate accountants, have argued that trying to quantify the exact dollar value of a puff of smoke, leaving a factory chimney over half a century, is an exercise in chaotic speculation. The variables are too complex, and the resulting numbers are too soft to be useful for making a firm budget decision for the upcoming quarter.
It's an analytical nightmare. So what is the abridged solution?
To maintain the utility of the tool, most firms encourage their safety professionals and financial analysts to use the abridged method. This means they intentionally draw a boundary around the company. They focus strictly on internal private costs, the costs incurred from organizational activities that result in product yield problems, injury incidents, direct liability, and internal maintenance.
So they just cut out the rest.
They consciously choose to ignore the external societal costs to make the economic analysis streamlined, mathematically defensible, and relevant for immediate internal decision-making.
That makes profound practical sense for today's market. You have to focus on what you can actually control and measure on next month's balance sheet. We will definitely circle back to the long-term dangers of that abridged mindset later, but first, we need to cover the final piece of the Big Five, the cost of risk.
Cost of risk is a foundational, macro-level metric. While ROI and payback period are often used to evaluate specific individual interventions, like one robotic lift, the cost of risk represents the total aggregate financial impact of all risk-related activities within the entire organization.
It's the big picture.
Is the comprehensive financial burden that operational risk places on the company's ledger.
The texts are very specific about the 4 major buckets of money that make up the overall cost of risk. It is much more than just the money spent fixing accidents after they happen.
Correct. The first bucket is risk transfer. That's the insurance premiums the company pays to shift catastrophic risk to a third party. The second bucket contains the costs for risks that actually materialize, primarily workers' compensation payouts and the administrative expenses of managing those claims.
Okay. And the third bucket is where the safety professional lives. Prevention and risk control programs. This is the capital invested in training, safety engineering, and hazard elimination.
And the final bucket is retained losses. These are the deductibles, the self-insured retentions, or the entirely uninsurable losses that the company has to absorb directly out of pocket when things go wrong.
What I find fascinating about the cost of risk formula is the dynamic tension between these buckets. If a company wants to lower its massive overall cost of risk, the most effective strategy might actually be to increase spending in one specific bucket.
Yes, the third bucket.
Right. They might need to proactively spend more on prevention and risk control to drastically drive down the astronomical costs of workers' comp claims and out-of-pocket retained losses, thereby bringing the total aggregate number down.
You are optimizing the mix. You balance risk financing against risk control to minimize the total financial drain on the organization.
Okay, let's take a breath. We have covered a massive amount of technical ground. We've mastered the formulas for profit margin translation, cost-benefit analysis, ROI, payback period, life cycle cost, and cost of risk. We have the mechanical tools. Now, we must shift from calculation to strategy. How does a safety professional deploy these numbers to actually shape the trajectory of the company?
The strategic application begins with understanding the profound importance of budget allocation. A dedicated safety budget is not just an accounting formality. It is the mechanism that allows for strategic, long-term planning and resource management.
It's the fuel.
Yes, a robust budget transitions the safety department from a reactive firefighting function where you were just scrambling to respond to the latest injury, into a proactive function that systematically identifies and dismantles systemic risk before it manifests.
But let's talk about the grim reality of corporate cycles. When the macroeconomic environment gets tough, or when a company misses its quarterly revenue targets, the safety budget is frequently the first thing placed on the chopping block. Executives look for quick cash and they think, well, we can defer that ergonomic training and we can delay upgrading the machine guards until next year.
The source material explicitly warns against this reflex. Slashing safety budgets to artificially inflate short-term profitability is a devastating financial trap. The texts are unequivocal on the outcome. Cutting safety budgets inevitably leads to a long-term disaster characterized by higher accident frequencies, skyrocketing comprehensive costs, ballooning insurance premiums, and devastated operational morale.
And the delayed impact of those hidden indirect losses we discussed earlier will eventually overwhelm and obliterate whatever short-term cash savings management thought they achieved.
Exactly.
The texts don't just state this as a theory, they provide empirical, peer-reviewed evidence to back it up. I want to highlight the specific study mentioned in the material by Veltri, Pagel, Bem, and Das from 2007. They investigated the core relationship between occupational safety and fundamental operating performance.
The Veltri study provides vital statistical ammunition for the safety professional. They analyzed manufacturing firms and found statistically significant relationships between robust safety programs and superior operating performance. It proves that safety isn't just a moral parallel to the business. It is deeply intertwined with the hard operational efficiency of the firm.
One specific metric from that study absolutely floored me. They looked at the perception gap. The researchers found that the wider the gap between management's perception of the safety program and the frontline employees' perception of that same program, the worse the company performed operationally.
Let's unpack what that gap actually represents on the floor. If the executive team sits in the boardroom and believes the safety culture is world-class, but the machinists on the floor believe the safety culture is negligent and dangerous, it indicates a catastrophic breakdown in communication, trust, and operational reality.
And the study proved that this specific breakdown in trust correlates directly with hard manufacturing losses. A high perception gap directly correlated with higher scrap costs, more rework costs, and overall higher production costs relative to industry competitors.
It makes perfect illogical sense. If your workforce feels unprotected and disregarded, they are distracted, they rush, and they disengage. Your manufacturing process literally produces more physical garbage, wastes more raw materials, and burns more time.
So bringing this to the CFO, a fully funded safety program isn't just about avoiding a $10,000 OSHA citation. It is about tightening the entire operational system, minimizing scrap, and maximizing the yield of your core business. Which brings us to the final strategic evolution mentioned in the text: contractor safety management.
The management of contractors is undergoing a massive shift. Historically, hiring companies viewed contractor safety as a basic compliance hurdle, just checking a box to ensure the contractor had basic insurance.
But the Smith text on contractor safety management reveals that it has evolved into a strategic weapon. I want to make sure I am interpreting this correctly. Are the sources saying that a phenomenal safety record is now a literal competitive advantage that helps a contracting firm win market share and generate revenue?
Absolutely. The business case for contractor safety management has eclipsed simple compliance. When a massive multinational corporation is preparing to award a major infrastructure contract, they might have 3 bidding contractors whose financial proposals are nearly identical.
Right.
How do they break the tie? They look at the safety metrics.
Because the massive corporation knows that an accident on their site, even if caused by a contractor, will incur all those indirect externalities we talked about: reputational damage, project delays, and potential joint liability lawsuits.
Exactly. The contractor who can mathematically prove, through their safety metrics and financial indicators, that they effectively manage their own risk and protect the overarching project timeline, fundamentally mitigates risk for the hiring corporation. That contractor provides a distinct competitive advantage. They win the bid. In this modern landscape, an elite safety culture is a powerful market differentiator.
It is a revenue generator. It all circles back to the very beginning of our conversation. Safety is an investment center. It wins massive commercial contracts, it drastically lowers manufacturing scrap rates, and it provides internal returns on investment of 50% or even 2,800% when hazards are targeted and neutralized efficiently.
But you can only unlock that strategic power, and you can only prove that value if you learn to speak the language of finance.
We have covered an immense amount of ground in this session of QHSE Talks. For the ASP 11 candidates and the safety leaders fighting for budget, let's synthesize the journey we've taken through these sources.
We started by confronting the safety professional's dilemma, the absolute necessity of translating the moral imperative of hazard control into the financial reality of corporate return. We learned that using cost terminology is not cynical. It is the most effective tool to secure the resources that save lives.
We mapped the true anatomy of a loss. We discovered that the visible direct costs, the medical bills, and regulatory fines are merely the tip of the iceberg. The real threat lies in the hidden, intangible, indirect costs. The massive disruptions to production, the lost supervisor time, business interruption, and plummeting morale. We established that in the crucial first few months following an incident, those indirect costs can be 4 to 5 times higher than the direct costs.
We then explored the behavioral economics of translating those losses. We calculated how a minor $500 injury could force a low-margin company to manufacture, market, and sell 1,000 additional units just to generate the pure profit needed to cover the total operational disruption. We demonstrated how a moderate $2,000 loss could easily equate to an employee working on the floor for 2.5 weeks, producing absolute zero value.
Then we armed you with the big 5 financial indicators. We used cost-benefit analysis to prove why a $50,000 upfront investment that yields a $100,000 net return is vastly superior to a cheap $20,000 fix that only yields a $5,000 net return, completely destroying the trap of short-termism.
We calculated return on investment, showing how a $10,000 wearable exoskeleton that saves $15,000 annually delivers a massive, highly coveted 50% ROI. We utilized the payback period to prove that a $20,000 robotic lift designed to eliminate a $176,000 annual ergonomic bleed will completely pay for itself in just under 6 weeks.
We expanded our timeline with life cycle costing, warning against the trap of the cheap printer by accounting for the cradle-to-grave expenses of equipment and personnel. We define the overarching cost of risk as the aggregate financial burden of risk transfer, realized claims, prevention investments, and retained out-of-pocket losses. And finally, we explored the strategic horizon, using the Veltri study to show how a strong safety culture eliminates manufacturing scrap, and how contractor safety metrics are now a primary driver for winning lucrative market share.
It is a comprehensive mathematical framework that elevates a safety professional from a reactive compliance monitor to a proactive, indispensable strategic partner.
It is a complete paradigm shift. But before we sign off on this QHSE Talks, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. Something to consider that builds on the foundation we laid today, but looks toward a very volatile horizon.
This thought circles back to the concept of abridged lifecycle costing that we analyzed earlier.
Right. The source material acknowledges that currently, businesses intentionally use an abridged economic model. They consciously choose to draw a boundary around their factories and ignore the externalities, the long-term environmental degradation, the broader societal health impacts of their industrial processes. They do this because it makes the math easier and allows them to make fast, internally focused financial decisions. They are operating inside an accounting bubble where the massive generational costs of their operational footprint never actually hit their balance sheet.
But anyone observing global trends knows that the regulatory and societal landscape is shifting rapidly beneath our feet.
So here is the question you must ask yourself as a modern safety leader. What happens in the very near future when changing global regulations suddenly force corporations to shatter that bubble and fully internalize those externalities? What happens on the day new international laws dictate that those massive, previously ignored societal and environmental costs must be calculated and placed directly onto a company's balance sheet overnight?
The financial shock to organizations that have spent decades relying on the abridged illusion will be catastrophic. Entire business models will become insolvent overnight.
And when that day comes, the safety professionals who have already mastered the concepts we discussed today, the ones who already fluently speak the language of comprehensive cost-benefit analysis, true life cycle costs, and long-term return on investment, they will be the only executives equipped to navigate that existential crisis. They will be the ones who rewire the corporation and save it from absolute financial ruin. By mastering Domain 1, Topic 13, you aren't just learning how to pass an exam, you are learning how to future-proof your entire organization against the realities of the 21st century.
It is a daunting responsibility, but an incredibly empowering reality for the profession.
Thank you so much for joining us for this session of QHSE Talks. We hope you feel armed, dangerous, and ready to walk into that boardroom or sit down for that exam and prove mathematically exactly what your work is worth, because suddenly those diagnostic muddy waters we talked about at the beginning, they don't look so murky anymore. You have the X-ray vision of finance. Keep pushing the boundaries, keep translating the value, and we will see you next time.